Jake Harper here from American Torah, and I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of talking about a specific Bible passage or even a specific book, I want to talk about the whole thing. And not really the Bible so much as the people who wrote the Bible. The Bible was written over a span of nearly 2,000 years, possibly even more, because there are sections of it that nobody knows really who wrote them down the first time, or whether they were passed down orally from generation to generation before someone finally wrote them down. For example, all of the book of Genesis, especially the first half of Genesis up through the life of Abraham. We know that Moses wrote everything down in the Torah, but he had his sources too. Maybe God dictated things to him, but it seems more likely that oral traditions of Abraham and Isaac and Joseph had been passed down to Moses, and he recorded them in the Torah. Now, of course, God guided him in that. I'm not saying that it wasn't divinely inspired. But consider the range of people who wrote Scripture. Start with Moses, who had a widely varied background himself. He was a shepherd, he was a general, he was a religious leader, all of these things. Some of the writers were songwriters, psalmists. David, Asaph, Solomon, the sons of Korah. Others were priests. Moses was a Levite, but he wasn't a priest like his brother Aaron. But Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Ezra were priests. Ezra and Luke were historians. John and Peter were fishermen. From the moment that Yeshua called them to be his disciples, they were at their boats with their nets. Amos was a shepherd, and so was Moses for 40 years. David was a shepherd. Samuel, Nehemiah, David, and many others were politicians or statesmen, high government officials of one kind or another. David, Solomon, Lemuel, who may also be Solomon, or kings. So the writers came from all of these different backgrounds, from fishermen and farmers up to scholars and kings. They also lived in very different cultures and times. Moses grew up in Egypt at the height of its power. Egypt was the world power at the time. Their culture was so different from Babylon or Rome that it's like the difference between modern America and modern China. 1500 BC, Moses was born and raised in Egypt. Fast forward 500 years and you get to Solomon. Solomon was born and raised in the palace in Jerusalem. He was the heir apparent of King David. He was recognized in his time as being one of the wisest, most intelligent men in the world. His experience, you couldn't have called the religion of the time Judaism, but for lack of a better term, the Judaism of his day would have been nothing like the Judaism of Yeshua's day, or certainly not like ours. And then fast forward another 500 years and you get to Ezra. Ezra was born in Jerusalem, but he was taken to Babylon with the rest of the nation. His entire family was murdered by the Babylonians. He was raised in Babylon, made to be a government official, and finally the governor of Judea under the Persian emperor. He probably wrote, he and Moses wrote the largest portion of the Old Testament between the two of them. Fast forward another 500 years, we come to the New Testament, and Paul was born in Tarsus in Turkey. This is a Greek city under Roman rule in Turkey. So out of these four men who wrote significant portions of the Bible, only one of them actually even grew up in Israel, and that was Solomon. Moses was born before anyone had ever heard of Rome or Greece. Same with Solomon. Greece and Rome were still hundreds of years away from being anything on the world scene. Ezra was born at a time when Greece was known, Rome was just getting its start, but Babylon and Persia were the world powers. And then Paul, he came along when Rome was at the height of its power. Greece had risen and fallen, but Greek culture permeated the entire empire. And then they were, well, I've described how the Bible was written by men with very different backgrounds. It was written by people with widely different cultural backgrounds. But even within single writers over their lifespan, their experiences changed dramatically. Take Joseph, for example. Joseph wasn't one of the authors of the Bible that we know of, but certainly his life experiences informed what was written about him. He started as a shepherd, or the younger brother of shepherds, sold into slavery, became a household manager of a high government official, then was put in prison, became the manager of the prison, then a prophet, and finally second in command of all of Egypt. Moses had some similar elements to his story. He was born in slavery, but was then adopted into the household of Pharaoh. He took on a position very similar to what Joseph had. He was a powerful general in the Egyptian army, and tradition says that he led armies into Ethiopia and against all of Egypt's enemies, and possibly even into Canaan. And then David started out life as a shepherd. He was brought into the palace in Jerusalem to be, well, not Jerusalem, but into Saul's palace, to be his personal singer, his personal companion. He became a soldier. When he and Saul had their falling out, he became a mercenary. Then he became a general. And finally, he became king of Israel. Paul started out life as a Torah scholar. He studied under one of the most famous rabbis who ever lived. He persecuted Christians violently. He would kidnap them from other cities and bring them back to Jerusalem to be tried. But then he had this life-changing experience, totally turned his life around and became the greatest preacher of the very thing he had persecuted for decades. From beginning to end, the Bible is written by people with such varied backgrounds across 1,500 years at least. It is the most remarkable book ever written. There is nothing else like it, not in literature, not in religious texts. And all of these people, even though they spoke different languages, lived in different cultures, had different upbringings, had different professions, they all told a consistent story of a God who created the universe, picked out a people to be his own special possession from all of the other nations, how he taught them and disciplined them through the ages, and finally his promise of redemption in the sending of the Messiah that was promised from the very beginning. The Bible is a coherent, consistent whole written by dozens of people across more than 1,000 years in different languages and cultures. That in itself is a miracle. It doesn't really matter who you are, where you come from, what your background is. The scriptures have something that will talk directly to you. Because out of all those people, at least one of them has experienced what you've experienced. Now maybe they haven't sat in front of Facebook, but they have sat in front of chatty, gossipy crowds of people, been the victim of rumors, fake news. The Bible was written for you. It wasn't written to you necessarily. But because of all of these experiences that God brought together, that God guided into this amazing work, the Bible was written for you. So I want you to read it. I want you to look for the experiences that those people had that are like yours. They will speak to you. This is Jay Carper from American Torah. Be blessed.